All right, we are now recording.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Lauren, and everyone at ACRL who makes these presentations happen. We'll go ahead and get going. Good morning, everyone, I think, or maybe early afternoon for some of you on the East Coast. Welcome to a Predatory Primer, what every librarian should know about problem publishers, brought to you by the ACRL Professional Development Committees. That's part of the University Library section. We're really delighted to have you and our presenters here today. I'm Laura Garapi, a co-chair of the committee, and I'll be moderating this program along with my fellow committee co-chair, Sam Harlow. And this is part of an ongoing series of online programs sponsored by our committee. And I'll invite, if Sam, you want to drop the link to our programs in the chat box, that would be great so folks can take a look. And before I introduce our presenters and the presentation more fully, I just wanted to reiterate or touch base on a few logistics, some of which Lauren from ACRL already mentioned. This session is being recorded. We'll send a link of the video, slides, and any other supplemental documentation to everyone who registered for the program. And big thanks to our presenters for being willing to share their slides. Very generous of you. The program will be an hour total, including time for questions. And please feel free to add questions into the chat box throughout the presentation at any time. Sam's going to be collating those questions and will be prepared to read them out to our presenters at appropriate times throughout the presentation and or the end, should there be any remaining. Lauren mentioned this, but as you use the chat feature, please make sure you send your messages to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see what you're asking. Should you select all panelists, it's just going to come to us. So we want to make sure everyone can see the dialogue that's happening. We are using the Zoom auto caption feature during this presentation to increase accessibility. If you find the captions to be taking up too much of your screen, depending on what type of device you're using in these COVID times, feel free to go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll see a live transcript category that you can click and select how or if those transcript notes display. We'll also post a link to a brief evaluation in the chat box after our Q&A session today, once the presentation wraps up. So please do take a moment to review our program and give both our presenters and our committee some feedback. But with all that out of the way, I'm very happy to actually start the program. I'll briefly introduce our presenters and then they can more fully introduce themselves as they see fit. So Nicole Weber is an assistant professor at the University Libraries of the University of Northern Colorado. In her role as part of the Library Research Services team, she assists faculty and students with scholarly communication efforts and is also the liaison librarian for the Montfort College of Business and the Departments of Communication Studies and Journalism and Media Studies. Very busy sounding, Nicole, as seems to be the case with most liaison librarians. Stephanie Wiegand is the online learning librarian and an associate professor with the University of Northern Colorado Libraries. She's a member of the Library Research Services Department as well, and works to develop accessible learning resources for students through a variety of platforms and assists others with the same. Stephanie's research interests are broad, but she is focused on faculty publishing and predatory journals with her research partner, Nicole, over the last few years. So without further delay, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Nicole and Stephanie, and you can hear all the great information they've got for our group today.
Great, thank you, Laura, and thank you to the Professional Development Committee for having us. We're excited to talk to you today. And since both of our cameras are working, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I'm Nicole and we'll hear from Stephanie in a few minutes. Before we really get into things, we thought we'd share with you the outcomes that we used to shape this presentation. So we hope to provide a history of predatory practices and how we got to where we are currently. And we hope to examine, and that you'll be able to examine and talk about the complexity and nuances of journal quality and academic publishing in general. And you will notice that we're going to use terms like predatory journals and predatory publishing, but we'll also touch on why that's problematic and not perfect. And then we're going to provide some practical takeaways so that you might think about and adjust how you discuss predatory publishing with faculty or in your libraries moving forward. So this will have a little bit less focus on what a predatory journal is and the specific characteristics, but we'll cover some of that along the way. And we have some further reading that you can really dig into some of those if you need a little bit more background information. So those are in our slides that we'll share later. And yes, questions are definitely welcome. So you can enter those into the chat and we will cover them as many as we can. And to kind of set the tone for today's session, we are going to ask you some questions through Mentimeter. So Sam has a direct link, I believe, that you can use to access the participant slide, but you can also go to menti.com and plug in the code. The code is 60120084. And it looks like it's working. I love all their colorful people. So we'll give that a minute. And as you come in, I'll just point out that we had to set up some questions in the quiz format so that we could ask all the questions that we want to in this session, but there are no points. Everything is a correct answer. It's just what the Mentimeter formatting is going to tell you at times. Okay, and I do believe you can keep coming in even as we kind of get started. So I'm going to move on. Our first question is just to gauge kind of who's in the room and how you compare with everyone. So on a scale of 1 to 5, oh, and I'm on, sorry, too early of a question. I knew that was going to happen. Let me see if I can fix this. I apologize. This is our first question. I apologize if you have to go back in. It might save, or you might have to come back. Looks like we still got a lot of floating people in there. There we go. So yes, all of your answers are correct. And we're just wondering what you feel like your knowledge of predatory publishing is on a scale of 1 to 5. And because it's in quiz format, we're not necessarily going to see your answers as they come in. So it'll be a big reveal at the end. And in our previous research, we've asked faculty similar questions, and we get a nice kind of bell curve. So we'll see how that kind of works out with our librarian audience.
I think it also has to do with differences day to day, because some days I feel fairly knowledgeable after having researched it for a few years, and sometimes I really don't feel very knowledgeable when something new comes up, because things are constantly changing too. So
there's a lot of change, yeah. And if there are any questions we can address at this point, we can take them, but our countdown is about to expire, so we'll see what happens. All right. Oh, there we go. So we've got a lot of 3s. Some people who feel more confident or like they know a little bit more, and some who aren't. Maybe just starting out with their exploration into predatory publishing. So thank you for participating in that one. Our next question is has 2 parts. So do you feel predatory publishing negatively impacts literature and research quality? So strongly agree or strongly disagree. And then do you feel or agree or disagree predatory publishing negatively impacts author reputation and or career? And this one I think will adjust while you answer. So you can kind of see we're weighted a little bit more toward agreeing that there are negative impacts both on the research quality and the career and reputation of authors. And it is our plan to kind of include our results of this in our slides, so you can take a look at those later, but it looks like we've kind of slowed down. And our final question is well, for right now, is word cloud. So what comes to mind? What do you associate with the topic or the concept of predatory publishing? And you can put in words or phrases. It handles phrases fairly well. And if you see something you agree with, you can fill out the form several times and kind of bump those words up to the top. So we'll give that a few minutes and kind of watch. So deceptive is a big one. Scam. We've got people who are familiar with Beal's list.
I'm seeing some different words for cost and fees and the money they make. Pay
This
to
is
publish.
this is a good word cloud. I'm glad we have so many people involved. Dishonest, money, expensive. Let's see if I can read some of the smaller ones quickly. Profitable, paywalls, dangerous, costly, unethical, sneaky. I like that. No peer review. We'll definitely talk about peer review. Criminal, con, inaccurate. Okay, so we kind of get the idea. I'm sure that'll keep moving around a little bit. But thank you. So that is our last question for now, but we are going to use a couple more Mentimeter questions. So you might keep that open in the background while we go back to our slides. And Stephanie is going to tell us a little bit about the history and how we got to where we are with predatory publishing.
Thanks, Nicole. So the past 30 years have once again revolutionized how we get information through scholarly journals. The creation of the internet and the evolution of digitization made this new economic model for scholarly journals possible. Open access journals where the author instead of the reader is going to pay for publication. And at this really early point in our presentation, we'd like to make a couple of things really quite clear. First, open access journals should not be equated with predatory publishing. Nicole, could you go to the next slide? Only a small subset of open access journals actually exhibit predatory characteristics. Any new economic model opens itself to those who wish to make money off of the new economic model with very little effort if they can. And bad actors have always existed in journal publishing. If you go back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, a set of medical journals existed that they claimed to be scholarly and scientific, but they were really existed mostly to act as advertisements for the latest and greatest of cures or treatments. Make you healthier, make you grow more hair, make you grow less hair, depending on what you wanted. So if we define predatory journals as those journals that charge lots of money with relatively little return on the investment in terms of quality control and improvement of presentation, then we would actually need to include some major reputable journals and publishers out there today. And we all know that some libraries are walking away from those major publishers now because the cost is just too high, especially at a time when library budgets are contracting. So what librarians and academia really object to is paying fees without receiving the benefit of the peer review process and other quality checks. Nicole, could you go to the next slide? However, fees are not passed on to peer reviewers. So there's this really strange dichotomy here where we're paying for this quality check, but the people who actually do the quality check don't ever receive the money that goes into that. Secondly, as librarians and academia, we object to paying for access and preservation of something that there's no guarantee that will be preserved or accessible down the road. And we worry that parts of the scholarly record are just simply going to disappear. Also, right now, Nicole and I would like to take a moment to clarify the language that we use in this presentation. It is the currently accepted language and terminology and the most widely known language and terminology for this practice, but we do recognize that it is inherently biased language. So in 2019, Nicole and I conducted interviews with some of the faculty on our campus. We asked them about their publishing practices, and at the very end, we brought up the idea of predatory publishing to gauge how much they knew about predatory publishing and predatory journals. And there were some faculty members who did not know the term, but because of the phrase itself, they automatically understood that this was something negative or something bad. Predator or predatory brings to mind ideas of aggression or strength attacking weaknesses. But as we'll later discuss in this presentation, Problematic publishers and authors sometimes have a symbiotic relationship and not a predator versus prey relationship. Further, the language of Black and white lists have been repeatedly noted as holding racist connotations. Yet we continue to use these terms. So even Cabell'S International, that now produces a list of problematic publishers that they have titled Predatory Reports, it is still widely known as Cabell'S Blacklist. I also think that it is likely that most of you will recognize or have heard of Beall's List, even if you're a new librarian. Setting aside the many controversies that arose from Beall's List, consider the fact that he had no specific definition for predatory journals. Instead, he had a list of criteria that could indicate a problematic journal or publisher. So when we're trying to calculate how many predatory publishers or how many predatory journals are out there, how can we possibly do this when we don't have a precise definition that, one, we've agreed on, and two, can actually include or exclude specific things? Beall's List is the shorthand title for his list. If you remember looking at it, if you had used it in the past, the actual full title is Beall's List: Potential, Possible, and Probable Predatory Scholar Open Access Journals and Publishers. Using the terms potential, possible, and probable underline just how imprecise and unreliable using a list can be. And yet individuals still use this list even though it was defunct as of 2017. Thus, in 2019, a group of researchers worked to find consensus on a definition of predatory journals. And what you see here is the definition that resulted. They focus on the self-interest of the journals and publishers in their practices, how they offer misleading or false information, they use aggressive marketing tactics, and they lack good publication practices, specifically peer review and other quality checks. Okay, so before Nicole talks about our next session about the spectrum of predatory journals and author motivations, let's take a moment to find out how often you receive questions about predatory publishers in your day-to-day work. So we've got another Mentimeter here, if you'd be willing to go back to that, and we'll take a quick look. So in my past work, I was a health sciences librarian at the same institution for many, many years. And my shift has changed my focus of my work. So I don't receive nearly as many questions about predatory journals as I used to, but I used to get quite a few. So I'm curious to see how many you receive, whether it's just every once in a while or it's fairly often, like once a month or so.
And I can say I probably get maybe 1 or 2 a year as a business librarian, and I work also with our communication and journalism studies. It comes up once in a while, but it's not as big of a topic for my areas as the sciences, for sure. Got a couple more seconds and we'll see what the room is dealing with. So we've got some nevers. Let's see, I think if I hover, we get percentages. Nope, maybe not. So 59 of you said never, a couple times a year, 66, most popular, 52, and then some of you get more than 10 a year. So that's probably quite a few for you to handle, I would think. So thank you for participating in that, and we will kind of discuss some of that. So some of the questions I've received are about the status of a journal or an email that was received, or sometimes they want help, especially students, but sometimes faculty, with the beginning of the process. Where would be a good outlet for my journal? And I still do receive questions about Beall's List, even though it's been taken down, because it's still very well known in academia and very popular. So my faculty are very familiar with that, and Cabell'S or Cabell'S has replaced that, but it's not as accessible and it's not as widely known yet. And I do acknowledge that the discussions I have had as a liaison to business programs is sometimes more centered around why was this title included on Beal's list from faculty who don't agree with that designation. So I tend to get those and how we can maybe make an argument for or try to figure out why it was included on or labeled as predatory. But like Stephanie mentioned in other disciplines, the conversations can be quite different. So I publish in a predatory journal, now what, can be a much more common conversation. And as librarians, we all know that the patron question often seems very simple on the face of things, but are really much more complex than is initially expressed. So predatory publishing journal quality is certainly one of those areas. And we just have a human desire to simplify, right? Tell me if it's good or bad so that I can get on with the true part of my research and the pieces that I actually care about and want to be working on. And that's not too dissimilar from when we work with students about source evaluation. Tell me what a good source is so I can write my paper. But we know there's a lot more to those questions than just, is it good or bad? And I think most faculty do know that there's a spectrum. There are some journals that are really good and some that are very bad, and there's a lot of middle. But they still have this desire to expedite or simplify the process. And it might be some faculty are just not used to this being a complicated process. We've had a lot of journals be added to the potential outlets that you can publish in the last few years, and that number just keeps growing. So depending on what their field is and how that's changed over time since they were learning the process, some faculty just might not be expecting it to be a very complicated process. So it's our job to kind of get them to slow down and figure out what is behind their question. So to do so, there are several factors that we can be thinking about, and these all kind of interrelate: author needs, time, values, and the market. And when we think about author needs, this is kind of the bigger one. Does the author have this pressure to publish, or are they getting support, financial support or otherwise? Sometimes we have faculty who just really need to have their name on a solo paper, and that's what's driving this particular publication. They might be working with a target number of publications to get tenure. They might need to get a paper in this evaluation cycle. So if they're feeling a lot of pressure, some of those might be coming to the top in terms of what they're looking for in a journal outlet. Others might feel like their research is very significant and they want to get it in front of a lot of eyes and get it as much attention and as broadly available and findable as possible. We work with grad students who are just learning the process, so they're not necessarily going to get in a top tier journal, but they're learning how to identify a journal and get something published. And then, of course, funding is always an issue. So do you have funds or opportunities for grants to help with either color page fees, article processing charges, and different fees that are common in some disciplines and maybe not in others. And then these other three, time, values, and market, there's kind of the author side and the publisher side. So when it comes to time, we're thinking more about how things can change over time. So journal quality and practices can certainly change over time and are not necessarily going to be always really great or always really problematic. And that's one of the problems that we've had with predatory labeling, is that it doesn't allow for those changes. It's almost like once it was on a list, especially Beal's list, and we weren't really sure why, it kind of had that label forever. It was a permanent mark, and that can be problematic. But certainly faculty criteria and their career stage changes over time as well. So lining up those timing and understanding that those needs change and those aspects change is important. We also have different values. So maybe as an author or a publisher, the focus is on being open access. Maybe the focus is on having a really great peer review process, or maybe the focus is on making money and a monetary aspect. So there are different values that might come to the top, especially as editors change and people involved change, or as authors learn more about different initiatives and publishing models. And then finally, the market can have a bigger influence than we like to admit sometimes. It can affect how a journal behaves. Maybe they need to implement fees where they didn't have to before. And maybe they know exactly how they want to do that, and maybe they have to kind of tweak that as they go. Authors' resources change over time. If the economy is maybe like it is now, they don't have funding sources for research as much as they did before, or their grant funding changes and that kind of thing. So all of these together, and probably there are more, kind of tell us that a good, bad binary is just not sufficient for our conversation. Because we're really at least talking about two different scales. So there's the overall journal quality, so the research quality in the journal kind of on average, because it will vary from one article to another. And then there's the publisher practices. And here we're kind of specifically thinking about the treatment of authors, but really the quality and the treatment or the practices are pretty independent. Practices that exploit authors can come from any publisher. And even though there are some practices that are more tied with quality than others, they should be kind of separate. And if you think about the points in the outermost corners, as we approach extremes, we can start to see some categories to talk about the different types of journal outlets that we're looking at. So if you have both great quality and practices that protect authors or really all the parties involved, that's the ideal. We would love to have a lot of journals like that. But if, depending on your values or goals as a publisher, you might be willing to sacrifice a little bit of quality to support certain initiatives. And maybe that's temporary. Again, that can change over time, but it might be that you just really want to follow certain values and let that lead your publication. In Quadrant 3, we get to when quality is low and practices are poor, and that's where typically our predatory conversations tend to focus. We think of these as terrible thing that no one should ever want, and that we should avoid them, but there are authors who find benefit and seek this out. So from an information science perspective, it's dispensable because we often know that they're not findable or indexed, or the research hasn't been polished as well, and it may not be preserved. So it's kind of just very ephemeral. It serves a narrow purpose for a particular time, and then it might just be gone. And then finally, in our lower right corner is the commercial, and there's the focus more on profit, right? Or maybe it's reputation, but it gets a pass because the quality is high. And remember, we're talking about the extreme corners. So it's not that every traditional publisher is not protective of author rights, but as we kind of land down in that corner, that's when we're really kind of sacrificing our author rights for the quality. And we know we're having more conversations about this as we see certain publishers that we think might be straying a little too far down into that corner. And overall, we think of this maybe sometimes as a separate conversation, when really should we be thinking about all of these publishers on the same plane according to these kind of two different scales. And there are reasons authors might publish in each of these areas. When we go back up to our ideal corner, obviously an author would love to publish here, but they might not be on that level yet, or they might not have funds if funds are required for publishing in those outlets. As we hit the aspirational quadrant, you might have authors who really feel they have the freedom and they've already kind of set up their career to support startups, or they might have more generous criteria that they have to follow in evaluations, or maybe they don't have criteria or they're not trying to get tenure. And then of course there are authors who do kind of aim for our predatory publishers, they need to get published quickly and get something on their CV. And evidence suggests that the evaluation committees and processes aren't necessarily catching those predatory publications. So authors can benefit from this, and there's evidence to say that that is happening. And so we talk a lot about consequences, but we've not really seen them realized as much as maybe we tend to talk about. Or of course, maybe they were deceived, and we don't like when that happens, of course. And then finally, Quadrant 4 can sometimes act as our default. So if you're starting out or you don't have funding, or you're just not as aware of the about the publishing options, you kind of tend towards those commercial, well-known options. So here I just have a selection of red flags that have kind of shown up in criteria, past and present. So I have some pulled from Cabell'S and some pulled from Beal's list. And those criteria for what they included on their predatory lists are similar. Cabell'S kind of cleaned up Beal's a little bit. But you can see, and I won't go through all of these in the interest of time, but when we have these lists of criteria, they might be based on values that aren't universal. They may not necessarily encourage us to think about all the publication models or traditional publishers, and they can be more subjective or imprecise than we realize. And that can be really problematic for startups and open access, as we know, but it's also very problematic for non-English language journals and non-Western journals, because our many quality indicators are favoring those English language journals and those that usually are US centric or US based. So sometimes our criteria are really kind of hurting those newer journals and startups and smaller outlets or international outlets because of our focus and where we've kind of ended up in publishing values. And transparency is certainly an issue that I think is getting a little bit better. One of the big issues with Beal's list was that there was no kind of supplementary material to tell you why a title was included on the list, whereas Cabell'S, it sounds like, is getting a little bit more transparent with that. I'm not one who has access to that, so I haven't played around with it too much on my own. But do we know, when we look at these lists and other lists, even the lists that try to highlight top journals, do we know why a journal was included, the methods behind that? When it comes to red flags, how are they deciding what is more severe, or how many red flags are too many? So that's just kind of to point out that lists, both those that call out problematic journals and those that highlight ideal ones, are just one tool, and we shouldn't completely rely on those. And to use them properly, we really need to understand their methods, their limitations, and also have this understanding that they're always going to be behind, because there's going to be new journals coming up, and it takes time to really do those lists properly and thoroughly check what should be included. So we need to establish a more comprehensive toolbox, and that's what we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But one of the reasons I really like the definition that came out of the Predatory Journal Summit that Stephanie shared is that they factored in a lot of these nuances and issues. And I think that that marks that we're headed in a little bit better direction in terms of how we manage and talk about predatory publishers or problematic publishers. So we have a final question and in our Mentimeter. So let me get that pulled up. And so we're just wondering at this point if you feel like you need to adjust how you discuss predatory journals with your faculty. And this is a strongly disagree, agree, strongly agree option. And maybe you don't agree with us, and that's fine. So maybe you don't need to change anything, or maybe you're very savvy with problematic publishers, and so you are already doing some of these things, or maybe you even have some points that you can add in our question section or in the chat that we should address. Give
So I've
that
been
a few seconds.
monitoring chat, and it's been very active. So I wanted to thank everybody for being this interested and engaged in our talk and the topic. Nicole, we're doing pretty good on time. So after this question and Mentimeter, do we want to take a few questions?
Absolutely, we can do that.
So I've been really interested in they've been talking more about language and specifically whether the word commercial should be used, how we would advise faculty who get rejected from a reputable publisher on whether they should publish with a less reputable publisher. So there's been some great questions and talk.
They're really good questions. Okay, so we'll just take a quick peek at our responses. So we have mostly agreement. We have some disagree and a little bit strongly disagree and a little bit strongly agree. So I think that's a good balance. It's definitely a controversial topic, right? Stephanie and I, when we write or make public presentations, we think about words and use the thesaurus for hours. So definitely, I like the question about whether we should use the word commercial. When I made that chart, I kind of went down to like the third definition of commercial, which is, we're mainly in this enterprise for profit, whereas it does have other connotations. And so sometimes what's the popular understanding of a word is more problematic than the fact that there is, a reason you might suggest some words. So yeah, are there other questions we want to pull out right now? Oops.
Okay, I have the questions from the beginning, and I'm just going to start from the beginning, and you all kind of addressed them, but maybe, and if you feel like you already did, you can just say, I feel like we addressed this. But the first one I saw in the chat was, do you see the issue of Cabell'S being a paid subscription as being problematic from an ethical standpoint?
Yep, that's definitely a good question, and one that comes up in our library all the time. I would say yes. I don't want to influence Stephanie necessarily. So
no, I agree that it's problematic that it is paid, and Nicole already talked about the fact that that is not a subscription that we have as a library. We made a decision that it was not something that we could support with. Maybe we would if we had all the money in the world. The fact is that we don't. But there's also a problem that it's behind a paywall. One of the great things about Beal's list, I mean, Beal was fabulous for bringing attention to the issue, but he also had this free list that was usable by everyone. I have a lot of problems with Beal's list, but there was some really good work that he did.
Yep. So they are, and I know it's Cabell'S or Cabell'S, depending on how you're feeling that day. I do think they've made some improvements, and it of course takes resources to do this kind of work, which I think has been their argument, but they can still be swayed by whatever business relations they have with other publishers, with other entities. And so we don't know exactly what their motivations are. And we can't necessarily, they do have an appeals process, but we can't necessarily be really involved in what the process is and, helping make it what as information professionals, what we think it should look like.
I'm going to add one thing before we go to the next question, which was early on, there was a lot of talk about some kind of Yelp-like review for journals, because it really needs to be the people that are working, the authors who are submitting to the journals and working with the journals, who are rating the journals. But again, Yelp makes profit. So who's going to create that and maintain that is a huge question.
Mm-hmm. And I think there is something that's being worked on from the same group of people that did the Predatory Journal Summit. So they're the Center for Journalology, and they're in our further reading. And so I think they're working on a tool, but it's going to take time. So you want to take one more question?
So the next one on the list is, does Ulrich do anything similar to Cabell'S?
So the short answer that is no. It really doesn't. I did see a little bit of this discussion, and they do list whether it's peer-reviewed or refereed. For medical journals, if you dig down really in, there is a difference between refereed and peer-reviewed. Not really pertinent to our conversation, but there are grades of peer review even. And they lump them all together as one, but really how they're getting that information is they're asking the journal. So they ask the journal what it does and how it operates and what they publish about. So all the information is actually coming from the people who publish the journal. The one way that I have used Ulrich's Web in looking at predatory journals or problematic journals or a journal somebody's worried about is to even see if they're indexed there. And if they're not indexed in Ulrich's Web, then I start asking questions about, well, why are they not indexed there? Because that is simply a massive list. And if it's not even included at that level, we need to take a much closer look at that journal title.
Yep, I agree. So do we want to continue at this point, or?
Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and get through, and then we should have a little bit of extra time for questions, I hope.
Very good.
So when we assist faculty with their publishing needs, we need to keep in mind our own professional values and professional standards. One of our guiding principles in librarianship is intellectual freedom. So what does this mean when it comes to authors choosing places to publish? It means that as librarians, we don't choose for our faculty where they publish. They might really appreciate us to do so, and they might ask us to do so, but it is neither our right or our responsibility to do so. Our work is to give them the skills and the tools and the information that they need to be able to weigh the benefits and drawbacks of various publication venues. And there is always going to be disciplinary information that we don't necessarily have that falls into that, which is one of the reasons that we shouldn't be making the decisions. Our educational role is also one of our standards, and our value of intellectual freedom also informs our educational role. And Nicole, if you could go to the next slide, please. So we don't do for the researcher. We want to teach the researcher how to do for themselves. So we're assisting them in their pursuit, but we're not making the decisions for them. And this follows again into our collections as far as our standards go. We are building spaces that offer researchers quality, depth, and diversity of collections. And Nicole, if you could go to the next slide. This means that we cannot focus on labeling third world publications as predatory and simply walking away. First world publishers can be predatory publishers as well. And we will find that new journals often suffer from growing pains, and they need to learn to be transparent, and they become reputable and quality control over time. It's not an overnight thing. There is no one size fits all answer to problematic publishers, even if we wish there were. So what can we do? What should we do? So let's talk about some practical steps that you can take, or we can all take, when working with academic authors. We'll outline both a few steps that are preventative in nature, but also some actions to take after a faculty member has submitted a manuscript to a predatory publisher and then comes to you for assistance. So our first basic rule is don't assume. Don't assume that faculty members are interested in finding the most ideal and most reputable journal to publish in every time they publish. They may be interested in the quickest way to get published so that they can secure tenure and or promotion. And so at a certain points in their career, they may really be looking for different characteristics of journals than in later points in their career. So don't assume that a librarian judging a journal to be predatory will be something that the discipline itself agrees on. One or two or even three predatory characteristics can and do show up in long-standing respected journals. Don't rely on lists. Lists are simplistic tools. They can be very, very helpful. But unless a journal has ceased to publish and and Nicole talked about this fact, a journal should be considered a living and evolving entity, which means that authors are going to have bad peer review experiences with and editing experiences with really, really good journals. And I'm sure that you all know faculty who've complained about such instances. Editorial boards and peer reviewers change over time, and the quality of the journal may go up and down because of that. New journals grow more experienced and provide better services. And reputable journals can actually be published by less reputable publishers, and that's happened too. So journals and publishers move on this continuum between the good and the bad. If you do use a list, make sure you understand how it's made and what determinations are being used to make its inclusion or exclusion from the list. And absolutely know, is there an appeals process and how conflicts about titles are adjudicated? Have a conversation with your authors. Spend the time to understand their discipline and their specific needs. So have conversations about time to publication, and if that's important, if having an impact factor is important, what their requirements are for tenure and promotion in their specific program or field, the type of article they want to publish. So somebody in the chat was mentioning trade journals. Absolutely, depending on your discipline, trade journals may be just as accepted and may even get higher acceptance than some of the peer-reviewed journals. More scholarly, I should say. Impress on researchers, if you can, to start looking for publication venues early on in their research process. Don't reinvent the wheel. So this is just really short and sweet. There are tools out there that have already been made to help researchers that you can send some of your authors to. Things like Think, Check, Submit is one that Nicole and I really like. It's created solely for the purpose of helping academic authors determine where to publish. These things exist. They're great tools. They're not the easy answer, which is why so many people would rather go to a list than this type of tool, but they're out there and they should be promoted to our faculty. All right, so ask for specifics. Now we're going to move into those subsequent measures. So somebody has come to you about accidentally or unknowingly submitting a manuscript to a predatory journal. Remember that the academic authors that seek your assistance with predatory journals after the fact are those that have unknowingly submitted, because you're not going to get the people who are using it to their advantage come to you about it. They go in full well knowing, and they want this to happen because it's going to get them published faster. So you're only ever really dealing with the people who are accidentally or unknowingly doing it. So it's the best first step that you can take is to get all the information you can of exactly what has happened to this point. Have they just submitted? Has it been approved? Is it already up online? If possible, ask for all the correspondence between the author and the journal. So have they paid a fee? Has the author hit the agree button so that they've signed over copyright? Or did they never sign over copyright and it's already posted? All of these things are things that you're going to need to look at to help them make a different, to help them make their pathway forward, I guess is what I want to say. Then you want to investigate the journal. So what author rights do they guarantee with this journal? Where is the journal actually based? Does it say it's a US company, but it's not actually a US company? Is the journal indexed anywhere? So it might be such a thing that it's a poor journal, but it's good enough that they should just not bang their head against the wall and try to get the article retracted. Do they offer waivers for any fees associated with getting published? You can contact editors from the editorial board. Learn what you can about the specific publisher and the specific journal. And you also want to gather knowledge about your local support and what's happening on your campus. You are part of the support system for academic authors at your institution, but you should not, hopefully, be alone there. So have conversations with your Office of Research, with your Writing Center, with the University Council. What are these entities on your campus doing to support academic authors who may have published in a predatory journals? So are there grant issues? That's something that the Office of Research is going to be much better able to handle. How does the university support authors against problematic journals in the fact that has the University Council set out cease and desist, that's what I want. No, that's not. I just said it wrong anyway. So official letters saying that we want you to take this down, we are not paying the fees. If there are those letters already out there floating around, can you reuse some of that already with your institution's letterhead and your university council having signed it? It is also important to think about the hyperlocal situation for this faculty member or author. Ask if their program or discipline has specific evaluation or tenure documents in place regarding predatory journals. So is there already something saying you cannot use these specific journals or this type of journal there? Are faculty going to be penalized for having published in a predatory journal if they include it on their veto when it comes to evaluation time? A big question is whether department evaluators, so colleagues or department chairs, are even going to recognize whether it's a predatory journal or not. Should they explain the situation to their faculty evaluators or their colleagues, or should they try and keep it as quiet as possible? In the end, it's not the librarian who can make these decisions for faculty or take actions on behalf of authors. Rather, we're there to help them think through the actions and consequences in both preventative and subsequent situations. So I'm just going to go really quickly into something that happened to me before, which was somebody, the first time I really dealt with this issue, and they wanted me to deal with it. Well, it's not something that I can take on for someone else. In the end, it's the author's responsibilities and their right to deal with it. We can only help them see the whole picture and what types of things they should be thinking of. So we're going to go back to questions and answers now, and we'd like to start by asking you a question, and please feel free to put it in the chat and continue to put stuff in the chat as we are answering questions. Do the programs at your institution include information on predatory journals in their evaluation and tenure procedures and documents? So this is to your knowledge whether they do or not. Obviously, you probably don't have access to all of those documents, but to your knowledge, is it being addressed in people's evaluation materials? And with that, I think we're ready for some more questions, Sam.
I think so. There's definitely great information and tools and thoughts in the chat. So I'm definitely going to save that and go back. So thanks for participating in that. And I can already see people kind of talking about this question about evaluation materials. I can say, at least for my liaison areas, it is technically addressed, but not very thoroughly. So they say I think for accreditation have to address predatory publishing, and they kind of just say, we will make sure that our faculty aren't publishing in predatory journals. And that's kind of the extent of it. So it can be pretty surface level sometimes.
So we have a lot of questions. So I'm just going to try to rapid fire through as many as I can based on when they came in. And if you feel like you already addressed them, just kind of say that and I'll move on quickly to the next one. So someone said, I've noticed that some predatory journals say they're peer reviewed. How do you recommend distinguishing between journals that's when they say they're peer reviewed?
I think the best tactic I have found is to see if you can find someone who's published in it and talk to them directly about their experience, or get in contact with the reviewers and editors and just kind of ask them, show interest in their journal and ask some questions that lead there. What do you think, Stephanie?
The only thing that I would add to that is there are some databases, and it's not foolproof. I know that there some get through, but depending on databases that it's indexed in, if you know the database takes a really close look at the journal before they choose to index it, that may be another way to tell whether the peer review is really a true peer review. And I'm thinking of PubMed right now off the top of my head.
So if a faculty member approaching tenure review has an article rejected by 3 respective journals, but is able to have it published by one of the problematic ones for a fee, what would you recommend?
I think for me, it depends on how it's problematic. So that's kind of a hard question to answer. I'm also not sure how I'd be willing to make a recommendation. If it's been rejected 3 times, I'm concerned that there's something wrong with how the article is written that is not getting addressed by the author, but that is obviously not something I can in any way say to the faculty member. Nicole, you want to weigh in on this? Because I don't know where to go from here.
It's very much it depends, you know, is it, why are they approaching you? What do they want you to do? Is it help me demonstrate that this is an okay outlet to my review board or peers, and then look at why it got flagged? If it's somebody else bringing up, you know, an article or a publication from a peer and they want you to kind of look at something they think is sketchy, then I would kind of have the same approach, you know, let's look at why it was flagged. So yeah, it's hard. And kind of the scenario questions are always difficult because it is just based on each very specific situation.
And I think you have to be honest with the author. So if you publish in this problematic journal, this may disappear after some time. Ask them that question about whether their peers are likely to recognize a problematic journal and whether that's likely to hit them in evaluation.
So another one is about, so for those of us who are new to this issue and want to learn more, what are some good resources for learning more?
We have a lot of resources in our further reading. This is just scratching the surface, but we have links to places like COPE has a discussion document that kind of goes through the basics. There we go. There's sometimes subject-specific guidance. And so if you're a liaison area, I would definitely kind of want to know what the conversations were in my area and how they were talking about predatory journals. We have a link to the Center for Journalology. So that's out of, I believe, Ottawa in Canada. And I think they're based in a hospital. So they might have a little bit more tendency to focus on the health sciences, but they have a lot of great information. And everything else we kind of have here is going to give you kind of an idea of the current state of things. So if you're not really sure what happened with Beal, we have an article on that. And Think, Check, Submit will give you a good start, and they have resources of their own as well.
I would also echo Nicole saying, look at if you're a liaison librarian, look at the literature in your area, because they've probably actually addressed this better than librarians have addressed this in the literature, at least from what I have seen overall. Learning more about it, I would also talk to my faculty because they may not see it as a problem. And they may have some really good information for you as well, because if it's addressed in their evaluation materials, that's going to be a great place to start as well, to see how they've addressed it and how they've talked about it.
So I don't think we're going to have probably time to finish up since we're at 2 till, and I think Laura's going to come on and do some wrap ups, but I did collect all the questions that I saw, and I'll continue to go back through here in the chat and make sure I didn't miss any in a document that we have.
If it's all right, I would just like to say that Nicole and I are happy if you email us questions as well. We may not have the answer you want, but we will try to do our best.
Yes, and thank you, Stephanie and Nicole, for being willing to do that. If you have a slide that has your email addresses on it, feel free to toss it up. I'm sure that we're also very good at Googling, being a group of librarians, so we'll find you. There are really excellent questions, and thank you so much for leading us in a discussion that garnered such a robust chat. I'm not sure I've seen a chat quite this active in one of these sessions we've done, so thank you. You clearly struck a chord. Just to wrap up, let me say thank you again, of course, first and foremost to Stephanie and Nicole for taking the time to share their expertise and information with us today. And also to the folks at ACRL who make this possible, specifically the indomitable Lois Sharp, who really makes every one of these presentations happen, and Lauren Carlton for helping us make this one today happen. You've seen me drop the evaluation link for this presentation a couple of times. I'll continue to drop that. Please do take a moment just to let Stephanie and Nicole know what you think and what we, Sam and I, might need to know about your perceptions of today's session as the co-chairs of the ACRL ULS Professional Development Committee. We will be sending out the recording to everyone who registered, as well as the slides that Nicole and Stephanie have been so generous to share. And with that said, thank you so much. We'll let you get on about your days. And Nicole and Stephanie, you can hang for a minute. Just a reminder, they can hear us chatting, so we won't debrief too much here. But thank you everybody else for such a great turnout for this session today.
Thanks, everyone.